Welcome to the Deconstructed Woman podcast, a podcast about breaking down barriers between women, exploring and sharing perspectives of each individual woman's experience, and discovering what we have in common and what makes us different. Hosted by Elisa Marie and Jojy.
Hi, welcome to the next episode of The Deconstructed Woman. Today we're going to be talking about what I think is a really interesting topic, which is what are the differences between the female and the male brain, and how does that impact us as we are growing up and raising kids and having careers and such. And so let's get right to it. And I'm going to introduce my co-host, Elisa Marie, and start from there. Lisa, do you have any opening statements you want to make?
No, I think that we had touched base as we were getting prepared for this episode about how a lot of the articles and research that we were looking at really indicated that there wasn't much differences biologically. And so I think that's where our kind of starting off point of, okay, if there's not a lot of differences biologically, why do we tend to see differences in male and female brains? So I think we were kind of getting into that a little bit right before this, but I think that's where you were saying before, it's kind of that nurture versus nature, and what do we do with that? How do we kind of address that?
Right. And so, I mean, both of us have had daughters, and then you have one son as well and two daughters. And so I think you're going to be like a great conversational person here to talk about, because you've seen both, and they're still young in their development, but you've seen very clear differences, I would imagine, between the way, boys may react in one situation versus girls. I understand that the sample size we're talking about is pretty small, but there definitely are differences. I have a grandson now, and so the way that he's developing is very different than the way my daughter was developing. And so it's been sort of an interesting kind of transition. I mean, I agree with you. When we read the articles, there was clearly this idea. There was a lot of confusion. It seemed like, every 10 years or so, there was a different overall assessment about it. And sometimes they seemed like they were very similar. Sometimes they were very different. But a couple of the things that I saw was that, boys are known to be more active, have better gross motor skills, do better in like spatial relations, whereas girls tend to be better communicators, and they are more relationship focused. And I think that feeds into, anyway, what I saw raising my daughter. When you look at the way your two oldest were developing, can you call out any similarities or differences between your two, daughter and son?
For me, I would say there was a stark difference between them, and something that I'm still trying to understand from a parenting perspective, because my son was very different from my daughter. Now, I think you have to take into consideration birth order in some ways, because my daughter also has a lot of characteristics of firstborns. So she's very well organized, and she is very orderly in how she does things. And she's not the kind of kid to jump off the slide or do, kind of what I would consider kind of dangerous things, if you will. So that's just not her personality. But then my son came along, and his just perspective on things is just starkly different. And all the feedback I kept getting from people is, oh, he's a boy. And I thought, okay, but he's growing up in the same environment, and we don't really, encourage specifically like boys versus girls things, but he's just more active. So kind of what you were just saying, he's more active. He's jumping off things. I think he went to the emergency room at least 3 times in the first year of life, because he was just constantly, it probably was the second year of life, because he wasn't quite moving the first year, but just like the amount of times that he knocks into things and is jumping, and all of this very active boyness that people are saying. And like, well, is that just because he's a boy, or is that just because, that's his child? And again, I don't know. It's hard to kind of piece that apart. But the feedback I kept getting was, well, he's just a boy. And my friends who have just boys, so they don't have any girls, when I go to their homes and I see my son interact with them, he's right on par with them. they're wrestling and just being more active. And again, it begs to ask the question, is there something, developmentally different from the girls? Because when we go over, my daughter's in the corner reading a book or writing in her journal, or, kind of keeping to herself. And again, that's kind of her personality. And the boys are just rough and tumbling all over the place. And so it's just an interesting kind of dynamic to see and to try to maneuver through.
Yeah. And having an only child, I think what I've read about only children is that they have aspects of, you know, oldest, youngest, and boy girl and all rolled up into one. And my daughter was definitely like that. I was clearly a tomboy growing up, and my daughter, I raised her sort of more in that way. And she went through different phases where she went, became more feminine or more masculine at different times in her life. But yeah, she definitely was a little bit of both. I mean, she liked to hang out with the boys, and when she did a lot of rough and tumble, skating or skateboarding or whatever. And then when she was with female friends, then they could, play with dolls or read or anything like that. So she was able to sort of fit the environment that she was in, but it was hard to know what her real personality was or what was different. I will say that my daughter, and I'm curious about your daughters, my daughter did, verbalize a lot more than little boys that were in her daycare. And so I think that that is something that is known to be a feminine trait. Do you see any differences between your son and your daughter when it comes to verbal ability to express themselves, talk in sentences or string words together, which I know are sort of milestones that doctors and parents are looking for? What did you find with your two kids?
So interestingly enough, my son is much more verbal than my daughter.
Oh,
He
that's interesting.
Yeah, so he is, but again, it goes back to personality because,
And birth order.
yeah, and possibly birth order. So, because, again, my daughter is very shy. She tends to she observes a room. She won't just kind of talk to people right out the bat. She kind of has to fill it out. She has to, determine what's the kind of vibe in the room before she'll start talking. And so she kind of has this, I don't know what you would call it, like a more reserved nature. And my son is just, he's out in the world. He walks into the room and he's like, hello, I'm here. He talks up anybody in the grocery store. He used to, I would let him play outside in the front of the house. And sometimes we'd have to kind of have him play in the backyard because he would want to talk to every single person who walked by our home. So he's just a very outspoken individual. So in that way, but I think in some ways, and again, it kind of goes back to that nurture versus nature and the environment. I really encourage all of my children to express themselves and to talk about things. And so I'm not sure if builds into it, because a lot of times I'll say, okay, use your words. What's going on? What's happening? And so he's very articulate about how he feels about different things, but he doesn't always use his words. Sometimes he'll punch something or throw something. And so again, it's like, okay, is that kind of the boyish thing? But if you sit down with him one-on-one and say, okay, what was going on? He can articulate what's happening for him and his experience in that moment.
Yeah, and I've seen that too. I had a conversation with my younger brother, whose first child is a boy, and one of our family members, our cousin, had a son and then a daughter, and then their daughter was born at the same time as my brother's son, and so because the girl, my hard to say now, but my female cousin, second cousin, her brother was older and sort of leading the way, whereas my brother's son was a first and only at that time, and their speech patterns were very different. And so I think that my brother's son was learning how to speak and taking his time doing that, whereas my second cousin was trying to keep up with her older brother, learning a lot of language and also being a lot more physical because her brother was physical. And I remember my brother saying, wonder if we should get him evaluated, with a speech therapist or something. And I'm like, no, this is just the way it is. I mean, boys tend to, talk late a little bit later. And, when you can't compare a boy and a girl and try to see what's normal there because they're so different. And the fact that she's number two and she's got an older brother and your son is number one and has nobody else that age to teach him, lead him, very different. It's like apples and oranges, and you can't compare the two. And of course, now, he's absolutely normal and, can talk and hold a conversation and such. And so it is very, very different. And he is a little bit of a shyer child versus, his younger sister, who's a lot more social. And so it does depend. It's so hard to tease out, personality, birth order, male, female, brains, if you want to say it. And so it is really hard to know, like, what, is your child this unique being, which we all want, but at the same time, when something sort of is perplexing, you're thinking, like, is that just who they are? Is this because of where they fall in the sibling group? Is it something specific to this child? I mean, it is really hard to tease out, and it does, continue to, I'm sure, confuse parents all along the way until you get to know them a little bit better and figure out, as they change and evolve and hormones kick in. So it's continues to be a mystery for a long time. I don't know exactly when you can say, the attributes of your son or your daughter, but it definitely keeps us guessing as parents. That's for sure.
It does.
Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. In terms of reading, do you find that, because your daughter is reading, she's a reader, that your son follows her lead in that way? Or do you think that he's much more comfortable being more physical and jumping and playing more, maybe taking a little bit more risk, whether you said, hurting himself or whatnot? I mean, do you think he copies your daughter, or do you feel that they're two different personalities when it comes to those kinds of things?
Yeah, so because, my daughter is so reserved and she's not a risk taker, he definitely didn't learn it from her. So he didn't learn like those kind of behaviors from her, but it just kind of it seemed from my perspective for him it seemed very natural that he was jumping and doing things and roughhousing and that sort of thing that I didn't see as much with my daughter. And so in looking at them both, I think that it's really hard to decide or determine, it's kind of like the chicken come before the egg and that sort of thing. I think that this also translates to, a lot of the things that we were talking about in the last couple of weeks too, because we were talking about, the differences between men and women and what that looks like. I think we were talking about, and I was saying how I got a book from the library that it was called Daddies Do It Differently. And I think that kind of sparked my thinking too of, is that a thing? Is this, am I missing something? Because again, if we go back to biologically, there's no differences. Is it purely environment that is causing these stark differences in how men and women think and interact with the world?
Yeah, it was curious because as I was doing some reading, it talked about how men do, because of the way that they have more of an imagination and they play more. And that was something that you had mentioned about how your husband parents, and how sometimes it's perceived that he has more fun or can make something as boring as breakfast more fun because they're building castles with waffles, whereas as moms, we're just trying to get them all fed and we're trying to get everything on the table and things like that. And then do we shoot ourselves in the foot as moms because we don't is it that we don't think that way, or is it that we don't make time for that, or we don't have the time for that, and because we have so many things that we need to get done in the morning? So I don't know, but have you had time to think about that, in terms of why that occurs? And as after you read that book and you've been sort of seeing that play out for the last couple of weeks, do you have any new thoughts on that?
Well, I think the biggest thing that kind of struck me, so this actually happened probably a couple of months ago. I was listening, I do a lot of listening to podcasts and blogs, and somebody was talking about just play with just play in general, playing with your children. And I kind of paused for a moment. I realized that is not a natural thing that occurs for me. And again, it may be kind of going back to the beginning of this conversation, maybe birth order, maybe, just personality, but play in general. I was kind of raised to think that you play after productive, like you work hard and then you play. And so I'm always working hard, but I never got to the play part because there's an unlimited amount of work that can be done. And so, that is something that was very foreign to me, the idea of play. Yet my husband seems to understand that and be able to do it naturally. And I think that that's a very interesting aspect that I haven't done a lot of research, just my own experience. And so I'm trying to foster more play, but it is honestly uncomfortable for me,
Mhm.
to like get down with the kids and say like, okay, we're going to play, with your action figures. I'm like, what do I do here? I don't really know how to play, yet he can do it very, very easily with I doubt that he has to think through what do I do next.
And just to share with our listeners just a bit of our background, you come from a siblingship of two and you have younger sister, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And I come from a siblingship of three, and I'm the middle child. I've got an older brother and a younger brother, and I'm sandwiched in between. And so reflecting on what you're saying, I think that because I had two brothers and they were always getting into trouble one way or the other, and then I was in the middle trying to referee the two of them. I think in certain ways I learned how to play because I don't think that I had as much permission to play as they did, just based on my family. And I was always there. I would say that I had responsibilities of an oldest child because I was the girl and I had to organize them and keep an eye on them. Even my older brother, because he didn't have to be as responsible as I was expected to be. So I sort of feel like I had like maybe, both those. I will say that having a daughter, I did know how to play with her only because I liked dolls and I liked, making tea and having like that kind of thing, though my daughter did not. And so everything I remembered from my childhood that I would try to give to her, she really didn't want any part of that. And so that was sort of interesting because I was trying to play in the way I knew how to play. And I don't think my husband necessarily knew how to play with a little girl. But so we were both sort of struggling. So I think that when you're an adult and you haven't had a lot of playtime in a long time because it's years since we were that age, now having to put ourselves back into that role might be more challenging for both sexes. But, I think definitely for women, because from what you're saying, your experience is that your husband sort of naturally gets into that role and can do that.
Yeah, and I would say that, now I'm like reflecting like the play that he's like the roughhousing, the like roughhousing play or going outside and throwing the ball or, that kind of very active play, that is where he's in his element. And since that's not me, that I don't relate to them on that way, but I will sit and read books with them all day long. So I think that maybe it, is not, there isn't much difference biologically. And so maybe we are looking at more of the environment and personality and maybe that plays into it. But I do see at least, again, kind of going back to the feedback that I've gotten from other parents and just seeing my son versus my daughters, that there is a difference, but I don't think that we can necessarily say there's a different female and male brain. I think there's probably two camps and people have been arguing it what it seems to be for quite some time. But, I think that maybe this filters into our next episode about gender neutral parenting and what that really means and how that pans out, because I think that there's a lot of newer generations are trying to create this foster this sense of things being neutral, and I think that sometimes that isn't necessarily the case because there is some societal environmental factors that we can't control, that are influencing everybody.
And the one last thing I'll say too, because as you were talking, something occurred to me, which is that I will say that my own maturation as an individual has made me so much less self conscious as well. So being silly with my grandson is not anything I would have probably done with my daughter because I was too in my head about it. I mean, I was too self-conscious about what would people think or what am I looking like or whatever. Whereas today, I don't care how foolish I look. It really does not bother me. I mean, if my grandson asked me to do a cartwheel through Panera, I probably would do it or try it just because I don't care. The most important thing to me right now is entertaining him and really spending that time with him doing whatever. Whereas I think when my daughter was younger, I'm still a working person, but I only have a certain amount of time with this child. And then I'm trying to maximize that. Whereas with my daughter, we had so many things we had to get done because, like we've talked about many times before, you got to come home, you got to get dinner on the table, you got to get them to a bath, you got to get them into bed, and then you do it all over again the next day. There just wasn't a lot of free time to just, play around. Whereas when we carve out time to spend time with our grandson, we're playing. We're not parenting, we're completely playing. That's all our responsibility is to have fun. And because I live in a different state from him, I try very hard to maximize that time with him and just have a really good time. So I do think that as women get less out of their heads and maybe a less self-conscious, feel more comfortable in our own skin, that maybe some of that allows, to take more of that kind of a risk and not care. I've seen a lot of people eyeball me in Panera when, we usually get together for brunch before we leave St. Louis or wherever. And I mean, I am acting foolish. There's just no doubt about it. And I'm having a good time. And it's just and I know that is different for me today at my age than it was when I was, in my early 30s with my daughter. I'm just 20 years makes a huge difference and I'm completely different. But I think this is a good time for us to transition and say goodbye and thank our listeners for all the fantastic feedback we've gotten. Thank you so much for the people who've been listening, sharing our podcast with their friends, and being kind enough to give us feedback via email, text, phone calls. Every single thing we hear has just been really encouraging and so supportive. So I did want to take the time to thank your friends and family, Elisa, and my friends and family, and even strangers who have given feedback. Thank you so much. It really gives us the encouragement and the courage to continue doing this and having our voices be heard. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It has been just such a fun experience to put this out there and to see the immense response that we've gotten. So out of this episode, but we hope that you'll listen to this next week as we kind of dive into our next topic. Again, we love that you're here and we hope to keep the conversation going. So thank you and we'll talk soon.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, The Deconstructed Woman. If you liked this podcast, please share it with your friends, rate this episode, or subscribe to be notified of all new content. We want to hear from you, our listener. Do you have thoughts on the discussions we're having? Want to share topic suggestions? Or want to join us for a topic that you're passionate about? Contact us at our email address, thedeconstructedwoman@gmail.com.